Thank you for those that have joined me in the actual room on Zoom. As I said, it's so helpful to actually look at someone. This is a conversation about a serpent. It's a conversation about a serpent that finds its way into biblical stories. It's a conversation about a serpent that makes its way known in South America, in the jungles, in their mythology. It's about a serpent that shows up in Hermetic texts. It's about a serpent that pretty much shows up all over the world. And as an ayahuasca facilitator of 10 years, most people that drink ayahuasca, it's one of the first things that's happened is they meet the serpent. So this is part of conversation about the serpent and what the serpent is. This is a conversation about the pineal gland and what the pineal gland is. This is a conversation about altering consciousness. It's about drugs. It's about cocaine. It's about DMT. It's about alcohol. It's about altered states. It's a conversation about inebriation, but it's also a conversation about breakthroughs and enlightenment and why it is that half the scientific breakthroughs that we've made in the last 50 years have happened while people were stoned or high. This is a really, really interesting, very, very I guess you could call it taboo subject. So that's just a little bit of an intro of where we're going. I'm just going to mute someone in this room there. And we're just going to begin right at the beginning. And of course, this is a massive subject, so this is not something that I can really do justice to too quickly. But what I can tell you is that we've been altering our consciousness essentially since the beginning of time. And it is such an incredible conversation because up until about 10 or 20 years ago, if you were to look at anthropological scholars, what they were saying is, we think that there was potential use for cannabis 3,000 years ago. And they started saying these really interesting things, like we know that mead, which is an alcoholic brew, has shown up quite a long time ago in culture, way before biblical references. But what gets really interesting is if you get deeper into the subject, you start discovering that, for instance, recently on a mummy or an esophagus that was brought up in Alexandria, they found a parchment on one of the mummies. And inside that parchment, and they're dating this about 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, there was a compartment with something DMT-based, a type of acacia. There was a compartment with a type of cocaine in it, and there was a compartment with THC in it. And this is basically dating about 9,000 years. The point I'm making is that our understanding of the fact that we have been altering our consciousness reaches back as far as our understanding of antiquity itself does. Why we've been altering our consciousness is a conversation all on its own. And of course, before we even get going, I want to make a disclaimer here that I'm not promoting anything. This is going to be, for some people, a very uncomfortable conversation. We all know when it comes to altering our consciousnesses that there are so many versions of doing this, and we know how destructive and detrimental, particularly some of the synthetic versions of these things that we kind of have can be. It's interesting to note, for instance, that like tobacco was used as an ancient type of medicine for thousands of years before we turned it into something that we use in the modern day. Cacao was used for thousands of years before we turned it into the modern kind of variations. Cocaine's the same story. Alcohol for thousands of years was a very, very low percentage. They think about 1.5% to 2.5%. In the mead. And so all I'm saying is that for a very long time, we had these natural versions of things that we then almost with our knowledge and understanding superseded, and I suppose you could say supersized. But the question that you also need to ask yourself is, how often are you altering your consciousness or your state? And you realize you're actually doing it every second of the day. If you have a cup of coffee, you are altering your state. If you breathe very deeply while watching the ocean, you are altering the state. And I think it's very important to know that you can alter your state internally from some sort of a mental or emotional process, or you can alter your state from the ingestion of some form of thing, which could be through your olfactory senses, it could be through your stomach, it could be, and this is just kind of begins to open this conversation for us that man essentially has been exploring altering his consciousness for a very long time. And then the question comes in, how long and why? And what becomes fascinating about this is that I just want to mention a few things, and I don't want to become too scholarly where I have to use this quote and tell you this guy. And I'm just going to give you an overview of some very interesting things here. There are some very, very top scholars, which are, for instance, like rabbis or what they call religious historians that are traveling all around the world at the moment and giving lectures on how many times psychedelics or natural medicines show up in the holy texts, in the Hebrew texts, in the books of Exodus, in et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to spend 40 minutes trying to convince you, but if it is something you're interested in at the end, I've saved an incredible amount of every subject I'm going to cover. I have basically an article covering who said it, where you can get the lecture, and it's absolutely mind-blowing. But to surmise for you, something I've been researching for many, many years is that there are natural or psychedelic or mentally enhancing substances that show up in every single part of what we would call modern history. And I'm talking about your biblical texts. I'm talking about your Hebrew texts. I'm talking about like an incredible amount of references. I'll use some just very common popular ones off the top of my head to help you to understand just how common it actually is. Who was it? Jacob, for instance. Jacob is a very, very famous scene. I think it's, I'm not good with this stuff. Genesis 32:30, I think. But Jacob essentially, he takes marigolds. It talks about his wife, Sarah. I might have the story wrong. I don't do the Bible very deeply. But he talks to his wife, Sarah, in the chapter before, and he asks her for his marigolds. And essentially, there's one of the most famous stories in history is the Battle of Pineal. But essentially what happens is Jacob, I think the verse 32:30 says that I have looked into the face. I'd actually like to find it for you guys very quickly because I'm going off subject, but not at all. Okay, so basically what it says is, I saw the face of God. That's basically what he says. And he calls the place where he finds the face of God. So in the verse, what's interesting, there's quite a long verse. The first thing is he gets to look at the face of God without dying. And the second thing is this place is so profound for him. And we must remember that Jacob was a very ordinary man. In the biblical story, he had jealousy, he had all sorts of problems. But what's quite interesting is this place where he gets to look in the eye of God in 32:30 Genesis, he calls pineal. He actually calls this place pineal. And I don't want to run right across history now, but what we discover when we look deeply into the subject is that this small cone-shaped thing inside our brain, which we don't know much about, we know that it creates melatonin, we know that it helps regulate sleep, we know that it is involved in altered consciousness. It is what Descartes, on the philosophical side, the Western side, called the seat of the soul. It is what the Buddhists call the third eye. It is what the Vedics, but anyway, I'm not going to go too deeply into it. I'm going to go on a tangent. But what's really interesting about this is that, let's talk the Bible a little bit more. In the Bible, Jesus constantly talks about thy single eye and how the single eye cannot actually see itself, but thy single eye, there's all these verses. So there are incredible amounts of references, and there are people that have dedicated their entire lives, scholars that are religious scholars that talk about this, and you guys must watch some of these videos. It's mind-blowing. But essentially, these are all talking about this little gland in our head, which Descartes spoke about, which religion spoke about, which the Hebrews spoke about, etc., etc. And what's fascinating is, even if you look at the Catholic faith, if you look at nearly all of the Catholic temples in the Vatican, they've got this cone-shaped thing, even at the top of the Pope's thing. So there's this whole idea of this pineal gland that's been hidden, essentially, in some ways. Now, what this has to do with the story of drugs is if we look at, first of all, from an androgynous perspective of what this little thing does, it appears that it creates a certain amount of DMT. Now, dimethyltryptamine is something that is found naturally in the body. And what's very interesting is we're not positive about this. This is very, very controversial research that is pushing and pulling at the moment. And there's some very interesting doctors, like some of you will know, Rick Strassman, and some top doctors. And what they're basically figuring out is it appears from what we know that during sleep, in our REM states, during pregnancy, actually delivering babies, and during near-death experiences, our body spikes in DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine, which also tends to have an effect on the body where it thins the layer of reality or the veil. And people that have ever experienced DMT, such as things like ayahuasca, there are many forms of DMT, yaje, yorpo, will tell you that essentially they speak about interacting with other realms, other beings, different dimensions, and that's just a very interesting thing. So what makes the story so interesting about DMT is that DMT can be found in thousands of different kinds of plants. And the reason why certain plants are used to make medicines, which are very ancient and used in origin cultures, is simply because some plants are higher in yield. In other words, there is more of it in them. You could find DMT in grass, not just in your own body, but there's so little DMT in certain types of grass that to make a medicine of it would take very long. But what I want us to get present to here is that this is one of the strongest drugs that are also show up so strongly, and that's DMT, and it's naturally being produced inside your body. So this is not really a conversation about DMT, but why I'm mentioning it is that DMT essentially seems to be the one substance that is naturally produced next to melatonin inside this pineal gland, which looks like this little pine cone inside your head. What's quite interesting to note for those people who follow the health lines, and that it appears in the modern day, because they do a lot of autopsies, that these pineal glands in human beings have begun to calcify. In other words, they've become hard and they're beginning to collapse. Now, it's interesting, if we follow the sacred texts and we believe what they're saying, even now you're going to be surprised. I'm jumping from the Bible to the Egyptians. The Egyptians have the Eye of Horus. And if you look at the Eye of Horus, this is really easy to research. You'll see that it's actually a side depiction of the head and where the pineal gland is. It's the Eye of Horus. It's, you know, they talk about the sun god and the whole, but it's the light, what the Buddhists call the inner light. And what's interesting about this whole subject is that we discover there are fascinating papers on this that are fully accredited, not just opinion, but that the Buddhists had a kind of ayahuasca as well, which means they were also drinking something, some people call it a tree of life brew or whatever, but it means they were also drinking a combination of plants to spike the DMT in the pineal gland. And they used different plants to make their ayahuasca, because essentially they used an acacia tree and something called Syrian rue or Perigum homilia. So it's a type of homala, yeah. And why this is interesting is we're discovering here in ancient Egypt, we're discovering in South America, and believe it or not, I don't know enough about this, but even these scholars are talking about Moses was standing in front of the acacia tree, which is a DMT tree, which was on fire while he was speaking to God. So we discover that DMT and altered states and sacred plants are littered across all of culture, and might have way much to do, more to do with the mythologies that we have than we think. But why the pineal gland? If we look at what Descartes was essentially saying, and we look at what the Buddhists are essentially saying, is that it is actually an aerial to the divine. If you are in a dimension, think of a radio station. If you're in a dimension and you turn the radio dial slightly, you hear a different radio station. And if you keep turning it, you hear a different radio station. And the theory goes, if you put together Hermetic texts, if you look at the Corpus Hermetica, if you look at all of these ancient texts, they're talking about how at the top of the scepter or of the magic rod or of the magician's staff, and they're talking about your spine, we'll get into that just now, is this magic scepter. You see it in all the religions, you see it in all the magicians, is this magic scepter being this pineal gland. And when that pineal gland is activated, you can pretty much transverse or access any information or wisdom in the entire universe. Wow, what a absolutely bizarre idea. And what's fascinating about this is, if it's true that our pineal glands are beginning to calcify and actually be less healthy due to heavy metals and things like that, one of the worst for the pineal gland, ironically enough, being fluoride, and I can't think of the other one. So that's why it's very interesting to look into that. But what would be interesting is, if it is true of what all these sacred texts are saying, including many of these philosophers, including the Hermetic artists who created basically modern medicine as we know, then you have a little aerial in your head that appears to not do much, that can connect you to all realms, that can connect you to other levels. And what's fascinating is that it can be done naturally, but we also know that it can be stimulated from the outside, which is where the conversation is going to get interesting when we start talking about drugs and cocaine and things like that, and why it's played such a big part in humanity. This is not only going to be about the spiritual side of things. So what we have at the moment is we have this conversation about this pineal gland inside your head that appears to stimulate our ability to connect to the divine or to other consciousness. And what's fascinating is, if this thing is getting sick, it would have a really big explanation to why mental disorders are on the rise and why we feel so alone, that suicide is rampant. Because essentially, if you have, imagine having a little aerial that all you have to do to speak to your God, your father, or whatever you want to call it, or your sacred mother, is close your eyes, just breathe a little bit and connect, and imagine those aerials of ours are beginning to calcify and we're feeling isolated and alone. It would mean that we would take the reality that we see around us far more seriously than we used to. And we would be disconnected from the animals, and we would not be able to feel the rivers and the oceans whispering and speaking to us. It's an incredible subject. And then, of course, we enter the subject of the serpent, which we're going to get into just now. The serpent is this energy that has been spoken about right from biblical times. It is right in Southern America and North America's mythology. And as you know, even the Hermetics, which were the ancient initiates of thousands of years ago, that brought us chemistry and medicine. And what do you notice? What is the symbol for modern medicine? Is the snake wrapped around kind of like a sword. It is literally the symbol that has sat there hermetically for thousands of years to show us there's some sort of a health and a power in that. Now, essentially, even if you ask Vedism, which I would say is the oldest school of knowledge we have access to on earth at the moment, we know that this is the kundalini rising. We know that we essentially have a sacral or a base. You don't even have to believe this spiritually, just look at your spine. And then you have 33 degrees, just like the 33 levels of consciousness in numerology, just like the 33 years of Christ, just like there's these degrees in your spine. And what's amazing about this, if you look at first of how the Vedics explain this, is that you start in your sacral center, your lowest chakra, which is your base energies, your will, your sexual energy, your need to, it's like your base will. And the idea would be that this energy can gradually and naturally, like a snake, rise a snail. I think that's what mine does. It's more like a snail than a snake. It's slow and on its own mission. But as the snake rises, this kundalini rises, and I want you to understand this mythology is everywhere. As this snail rises, it hits the different chakras, and a couple of interesting things happen. Now, you don't even have to believe in chakras, because we're going to see this in other areas. You hit an initiation for each chakra. An initiation means you will go through a very, very dark crisis regarding that particular thing. Like, for instance, when you hit the heart, the shamans have spoken for thousands of years about the great initiation where you pierce the heart, you get your heart broken. We know in Jungian psychology that one of the ways of having an ego death is to be betrayed. They speak about it very strongly, where your psyche literally collapses in on you. So what I'm saying is, as this beautiful snake rises, it brings this power wanting to eventually unite with this pineal gland in some form of rapturous enlightenment, but it has a long route to go before it gets there. And we find nearly all mythology somehow hinting to the temple. What is this? Sides of your head, called a temple, hinting to the fact that this light will eventually enter into your temple. And this is a magnificent idea, because it means that we can spend a whole lifetime stuck in just that base energy, and that's okay. But if we're able to clear that energy and that serpent begins to rise, and that's why the serpent's been known as powerful and dark, and because when it hits the next chakra, you now have to basically activate that new spiritual center, and all the initiations of that center begin to hit you. The madness, the problems, the outside world will reflect it. And it's almost like you'll have to meet those challenges before one day that serpent begins to rise again. And this mythical story, I mean, Dante's Inferno, there are so many things where they talk about the seven. I know it sounds funny that it's 33, but it's broken into 7 areas. In the Bible, they talk about the 7 kingdoms of God. There's so many things where they talk about these 7 levels. Dante talks about the 7 levels of hell. And basically, the lower your energy is, the more difficult your experiences are. So this is not something that's locked in one person's ideal. And I just want you to consider for a second, because we're going to start talking about normal drugs shortly and like what is actually going on there. But I want you to just consider how magnificent the human body is, that for thousands of years, right across the continent, shamans of the ancients have known that if you drink potions, or ancient Hebrew masters have known that if you mixed acacia and you drink it, that serpent will be forced to rise and it will hit thy single eye, and you will have that rapturous understanding, which will be temporary, which is an interesting conversation in its own. And of course, what we see in psychedelic journeys is, as it rises, wherever your block is, that's kind of the experience usually that you will have. And I find this all very beautiful and fascinating. And it makes me think very deeply about my pineal gland. You know, if you think about the Buddhist scholars, they didn't drink anything, but they would use what you call like immersive therapies, or what you could call deprivation therapies. In other words, locking themselves in a dark cave without food or water, where it's so dark they can't even see their hand in front of their eyes. And after days and days and days, they go into this very deep trance where they're near death. And as the texts go in the book of Egyptian Book of Dead, the inner light explodes. It's exactly the same thing. They all have different ways of getting this pineal gland to. And sometimes people have spontaneous enlightenment or breakthroughs where they're literally reading a book, or something happens, or they're making love, or they're on a drug, and that serpent gets invoked and starts to go up the spine in this rapturous experience and hits thy single eye, and you have this experience. Wow, what a magnificent story. And it's quite incredible, because if you look in the scriptures, like the Gnostic texts, the Christian Gnostic texts and the Rosicrucian texts, they talk about the 33 levels of each level of your spine as that power is rising. It's absolutely incredible. But let's talk about like more everyday things, right? So how much do you actually know about drugs? It's such an interesting subject. I mean, when you take a substance, there are many kinds of drugs. There are ego-enforcing drugs. There are ego-disillusion drugs. And we do know that for the first time, like if you look at organizations like MAPS, that we have massive breakthroughs going down where these organizations are taking the taboo out of certain substances. I myself, as I told you, I work with ayahuasca. I have been for about 10 years, which is a DMT-based medicine. And I have seen it change incredible amounts of lives. But I also, for instance, work with MDMA for people with trauma. And that is not a natural substance. So we are becoming more and more aware of the alchemy and the ability to hack the actual brain. But let's talk beyond spirituality. Let's just talk every day. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but most of what we know about society, like if I hold my hand up, the fact that I'm healthy and alive because I've undergone a few medical processes when I was a child is due to drugs. And if you think about that, it's a very strange thing, but I don't even mean the drugs that they gave me. I mean, the fact that we even know what DNA is. Now, I want you to, why am I talking about DNA? DNA is the inner serpent. It's literally the representation within our body of the serpent. But we only really made massive leaps in biology once we figured out what DNA was. How did we figure out what DNA was? I think his name was Crick. The guy was cooking on LSD. You can research it if you're on your phone. I can't, obviously. He was cooking on LSD. The guy was absolutely off his head. I think his name was Crick. But he was in the middle of an hallucination and he was watching the serpent kind of thing and he realized, oh my God, he thinks he knows what DNA is. This is a true story. Don't take my word for it. Go and research whatever I say to you. And this is mind-blowing because we're talking about medicine completely changing because a guy was on LSD. But I mean, now we stick on LSD. Who else? Like Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, I've actually got an article over here. Steve Jobs, literally, when they asked him what he attributes his success to, he gave a list of 6 things. The first thing was LSD. I have a list of people, just for interest's sake, when I was doing some research, I didn't think that I was going to talk about it at all, but of discoveries that were, but basically, there's like 8 of the top computing analysis of all time. They said it was LSD. DNA, we only know about DNA because of LSD. Most of what we know about psychology, we only know because of LSD. Cocaine gave rise to all of psychoanalysis. I mean, how mind-blowing is that? So anyway, I'm not going to keep going, guys. This is what I'm hoping this talk does is it excites you and it stimulates you to go and research the subject. But what does this actually have to do with the serpent? What does this have to do with this pineal gland? Because I'm almost suggesting controversially up until now that the Hermetics were right. And what they have been saying for thousands of years is that your body is a direct representation of the entire universe. And basically, your mind is a mini universe and you can access, the reason, do you guys know the story behind Atlas? He's that dude with the world on his shoulders. Do you know much about the names of the muscles and whatever? Do you know what Atlas is? It's the burden of holding up the human brain. It's the burden of experiencing consciousness, of actually being aware of what's going on and making decisions and choices in life. How mind-blowing is that? And that's not just my opinion. That's a known fact in people that work with symbolism. So why am I sharing that is I'm suggesting that there is some divine intelligence behind the creation of your body. And it has given you absolute carte blanche on the decisions you make. But through sacred knowledge and personal experience, you realize that if you do certain things, you can get your power to increase. And of course, it takes mystery schools sometimes in very dark periods. I think humanity's been going for hundreds and thousands of years. And during the dark periods, we can only hide this information in shamans and in mystery schools like Alexandra, etc. And can just imagine the idea that you are left to live whatever life you wish to. But when you want to begin to climb those 33 stairs, and eventually, now what's fascinating is I don't want to use all the Bible quotes, but to be seated on the right side of the Father. And if you actually listen, I've got a clip I can upload for you guys about a Christian guy who speaks about how the Bible is often an explanation of the parts of the brain. It's fascinating. So I just want us to connect to how powerful that is. The snake, he's everywhere. And he's been whispering for hundreds and thousands of years. As soon as you go into an altered state, which could be from prayer, it could be from, he's whispering about this power of rising up your own scepter or your magic wand to this thing at the top, and the perilous journey that you will face as you go. What a magnificent thing. I mean, Dante's Inferno, the idea is man actually goes down into the 7 levels and then needs to find his way back up. And that would be really exciting regarding your spiritual journey and how personal it would be to one day to decide, you know what, I want to begin to rise and face the initiations of those things. But that still doesn't explain to us what this has to do with some guy doing cocaine at the turn of the century and making massive breakthroughs, changing psychology forever. This doesn't tell us about the psychotherapist that dropped LSD and changed our understanding of the mind forever. This doesn't tell us about the people that were on cannabis and literally changed society. Here's an example, Pythagoras. He used to get so high on ergo. Ergo is like, we're not exactly sure what it was, but it was a type of psychedelic. Pythagoras was the most spiritual dude. Like, he believed every number had these incredible, like, 1 was the number of God, 2 was the number of duality, when all of reality began to split and fight against each other. 3 was the Holy Trinity, where this guy was absolutely bent in his head. And think about most of what we know about mathematical formulas were from this guy who used to get together with his, yes, he had students, I can't remember what they were called, but he would initiate them into some spiritual thing. The point is, Pythagoras was a spiritual weirdo, used to, like a magician, take mind-altering things. That's Pythagoras. Guys, I could do this all night. People that, like I said, Crick, that changed the world high. So now, am I promoting that? Well, now I'm telling 2 very different stories here. I'm telling the story of this ancient knowledge about the temple that you are and the scepter that you are, with this beautiful thing and this journey that you can take to rise and face those things, to eventually take your seat in what they call eternity, or many of the sacred texts say that your gift to eternal life is when you can be seated inside this temple. In other words, rise out of your lower bodies. But now I'm also talking about the fact that humanity has been completely changed by cocaine and alcohol. And sure, I can think of so many examples, but let's not harp on that. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, it's quite simple. That snake, and I'm just calling it a snake, it's just proverbial, it's just metaphoric, but that rising of your energy to explode into your mind can be stimulated in so many different ways. And unfortunately, as we've become more and more synthetic, we've learned to force it even more. And the fact of the matter is that when you put the mind in an altered state, it is able to perceive a problem from a different angle. And therefore, we're able to make breakthroughs. But I want us to just consider anyone who's ever been on a journey. I know mine was very much ecstasy when I was a young man. I thought it was going to change the whole world. It was beautiful. It changed me forever. But it was a journey of love. But the point is, it's very short-lived. It doesn't last. And I think that we learn a lot about ourselves through the usage of these drugs and these substances, and we can make profound breakthroughs. And if you don't believe that, if your religious blocking is stopping you from believing that, you need to get into history and actually discover that most of what we know is because of drugs. It's a really hard fact. But I want to add something. Those guys very often lived devastating lives and died horribly. They did not die enlightened and peaceful, from Freud to Crick to all of those guys. So I am certainly not saying that we should all be taking drugs. So what am I saying? I'm suggesting that there is a sacred, beautiful path that you can take, even using external things from earth or however you want to perceive it, to stimulate that growth. But the things that are taken externally, according to the ancient scriptures and according to my own experience, they push that kundalini rising to a temporary awakening, which gives you a couple of things, which is quite amazing. You can have realizations. You can get to glimpse into the heaven worlds for short whiles, but it's temporary. And what substances and drugs essentially do is they give us a chance to almost, have you ever seen that game at the markets where you have to hit that thing, and that thing shoots up, and it tries to hit the top. And I often think of drug use like that. I know that you can have profoundly spiritual experiences on nearly any drug, especially the first time you have it. And I want you to consider that it's like that person who goes, and the thing goes, and the snake, and you have that experience. The problem is eventually you have to hit that thing harder and harder. And we are using substances that are really not very good for us and that are degrading our body. And so I want us to realize that most drug use is a temporary access to this kingdom of heaven, essentially. And some of them far more damaging than others. But they definitely have a place in society because, wow, man, guys, you must just go read the list of breakthroughs that have been made mathematically on cannabis. It's mind-blowing. I'm talking like famous people that have solved problems that have bugged us for hundreds of years, that were sitting stoned and suddenly realized. So there's no doubt that we can access this beautiful world, but there is definitely a path, which is one of an initiate, one of discipline, one of wisdom, one of patience, and one of facing the difficulties and the dark nights of the soul that come up with each level as we evolve, as we face if you look at your sacral center, your self-worth, your shame, your sexuality, your need to be wanted. As that energy rises, you have to face your solar plexus, which is your willpower, your discipline, your boundaries. As it rises, you hit the heart. You have to face your wounding. You have to face rejection. You have to face universal love. You have to face all sorts of things about love. And then as it hits your throat, you would be in the lifetime of becoming a speaker and invoking your power and healing people through words and inspiring them. And as it goes, and then it hits your pineal gland, and that's when we become more rapturous beings. What a beautiful journey, like Jacob's ladder. It's magnificent. But we have to acknowledge that we can force these things in everyday society and that it gets done all the time. And it's a beautiful thing that we're just able to recognize that if we do make wonderful breakthroughs while sitting stoned or while having a glass of wine, and that we realize that these are temporary accesses. And I don't do good or bad. I don't believe in right or wrong, but that we're just aware that this is an opportunity for us to almost cheekily, and we've done it forever, glimpse into the stairwell that can actually be climbed permanently. And I think that would be my closing thoughts, would be to just be aware of the fact that one day when we're done with forcing up this stairway, when we're done with chasing the snake out of its shameful cage at the bottom and chasing it up to try and reach some sort of version of heaven because we're lonely and lost, when we're finally ready to sit down and face ourselves, and we're finally ready to do the work, and we're finally ready to get disciplined and stop making excuses, and we do the shadow path of love. And I say the shadow path because you have to face some very difficult things about yourself before that serpent starts to leave the base. And it's a path of self-love. And I think it's one that's magnificent. And what I love so much about the story is it makes you realize that religion and shamanism and drug addicts, and there's very little difference in everything that's going on. We all want to return to the kingdom of heaven, which in some ways represented within our minds. And I do believe that there is an eternal state that is available to us there. We all know what it feels like to be rapturous. We all know what it feels like to be stuck in our lower thought forms and body. And there is no doubt, according to all of antiquity and all historians and all special scholars, that there is a longer, more beautiful journey that can be walked. And I think that the sad thing is we lose most of our people trying to hijack or to cheat their way essentially into heaven. And I mean heaven just metaphorically. And I think that's a magnificent thing to ask yourself. How many times do you have left in your body before, because eventually near the end, you're near death and you're still trying to hijack your way in to feeling better or seeing things differently just one last time before you die? Or are you willing to take the longer road and not feel good for a while and begin that journey up your spine and invoke your own sacred medicine? Wonderful. I'm just going to push stop for us quickly. Yeah.